My name is Lawrence. I've been working in Drupal since about 2008, and I'm a team lead at the American College of Physicians in Philadelphia. And if you're anything like me, there's a lot of institutional pressure not to spend a lot of time fixing what ain't broke. And it ain't broke as long as nobody else has to deal with the maintenance headaches. So this talk is, let's talk about what there is and isn't, so that you can go do something else for your last session or go get a coffee before the closing plenary if this isn't really what you're here for. First, this session is aimed at people who are not already experts in deployment engineering and not even really experts in Drupal as a whole. If you're new to Drupal, or if you find yourself maintaining older sites, and especially if you did not create them yourself, then there's probably something useful for you. Some of the topics we'll cover in sufficient detail that you'll be able to go out and act on them now, but most of the things will be topics for you to research additionally later. Specifically, we'll talk about using drush patch file to extend drush to handle patch management, which for today's purposes we will define as automatically reapplying patches when the contrib or usually contrib module is updated, or if something is broken and the module is basically abandoned by the maintainer, what can you do about it? For this part, I'll assume that you're familiar with version control and drush and what a patch is, but I will not assume that you've ever patched anything before or contributed to contrib or core on Drupal.org before. We'll look at behavior testing using bhat to make sure that updates that you make don't break basic functionality on your site, but we will not create a detailed testing plan, nor will we talk about how to specifically install bhat or hook it specifically into any build process that you have. We'll also acknowledge the existence of visual regression testing, but we won't review specific platforms. We'll look at monitoring basic site health with Nagios, New Relic, or if necessary, a total kludge, and why you might want to do that. And we'll talk about using Drupal as a data store for more complex display tasks, also known as headless Drupal, by outputting nodes as JSON and other machine-readable formats. Other than a few basic examples using AngularJS, we're not going to go into a deep dive about which specific front-end technology is right for you. I think there were at least a couple of headless sessions, and I assume the videos will be posted shortly. The difference is that we'll be looking at the Drupal 7 options for that, and whereas Drupal 8, that's already basically right out of the box. For this section, we'll assume that you know your way around creating views, but not a whole lot else. So if this means that you don't need to see any examples other than knowing that these things exist to get the gist of it, then you will probably be bored and can go next door. And if not, I mean, unless you really like nerd puns, which I try to sprinkle in fairly frequently. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. But first, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Let's play a quick game of Never Have I Ever. There's 5 of us. Let's put up our hands. And when I say something that you're guilty of, you put your hand down, and mine will go down literally right away. I'm not kidding. I can see all of you. So never have I ever broken stage accidentally by pulling the prod database and forgetting to change the API endpoint variable back to the stage version. Have you done it? Then, no, you haven't? You're not guilty of that? Okay. Never have I accidentally done the reverse, broken something in production by leaving a stage value in the, okay. Never have I ever made a typo while filling out a settings form that costs you hours because it's like, this was working, it's exactly the same as it is in dev. Okay, then for any of you who have your hands still up, like none of you are guilty about that, go pee. We'll be done in 2 minutes. But for all of us who put our hands down, it's not your fault. Admin AI is hard, even when you have dedicated teams working on it all the time. And in Drupal, we have thousands and thousands of contributors who each have their own preferred ways of making administration screens for the modules that they contribute. And that's why you kind of, even if you use something a lot, you'll frequently be going like, oh, I think that one's under structure. No, wait, it's under configuration. No, and then if you've got the search toolbar, you just kind of, all right, forget it, I'll just type it in. Maybe some of them have drop-downs and others have ticky boxes, and it can get confusing even for the best of intentions, and that leads to human error, that leads to mistakes. So my first piece of advice is to clean some things up by using platform-specific, setting your platform-specific values, or really even if it's not platform-specific, if it's not something that changes outside of the build process, if you don't need to let a less privileged user change a setting, then there are ways to hide that. Set them in a different process. Set them once and forget about them, or set them in a way that you can make reasonable changes to. And then hide the admin screens using permissions. You can also disable some unnecessary UI modules, like Rules UI and Views UI both come as separate modules that you can just turn off, and then poof, those things disappear from your admin menu. If you need to make a change on production, you turn it back on, you do your change, you turn it back off again. There are also some third-party things like the Habitat module from ZivTech does this, but it lets you like say, oh, I know I'm on dev, therefore enable or disable these modules. I don't have any personal experience with those, but they are out there. Start by figuring out which modules are using values that change from platform to platform, like test versus live modes for PayPal or for other payment gateway settings, where on live you always wanted to point at the live thing, but on dev you wanted to accept whatever. The devel module offers this great variables list that lets you compare side by side all the different variables across your platforms, and you can make a note of which ones are different. If you're using some form of continuous integration or build automation, you can probably add something to your build scripts. For example, at ACP, we use Jenkins to trigger Capistrano builds, and in the cap Ruby files are the like, oh, okay, so for dev, we're gonna set these variables, for stage, we're gonna set these variables, for prod, we're gonna set these variables, and then every time a build happens, they just get set depending on what's being targeted. Stealing from the Drupal 8 world, you can still utilize your settings.php file. This feature here that says if a settings.local.php file exists, then read that in. That's still not in at least as of last night, it was not yet in D7. The case that was open for it 7 years ago to get that put in D7 is still open and under needs review, but it was pushed forward into D8 and it's in D8. But there's nothing to stop you from adding those 3 lines to the bottom of your settings.php, and then you can create individual outside of version control files just that live on those platforms to set those variables. So housekeeping over, we go to chapter 1. How do we deal with absentee module maintainers, of which I am one? I'm not trying to diss anybody who is a module maintainer in the room. The reality, life changes, life gets in the way, you have to move on to different things. So let's take a look at how to patch your modules in a way that is manageable for you. Luckily, this is a process that it's not that complicated, and we're going to have to do it whether you solve the problem yourself or whether you find it in the issue queue and you do it yourself. So if we're going to do that, we may as well do that whole thing in a Drupal-ish way. So for any problem that you might encounter, you would open an issue for your problem. If you fix it yourself, you would submit the patch for your problem. And then this is the key in our example, we're going to treat the patch that you wrote as if it's any other patch that somebody else wrote. Because once you've contributed it to Drupal.org, that's exactly what it is. It is just a patch that's there. So instead of treating third-party patches and first-party patches differently, we're going to treat them the same. To start with that, I'm going to kind of jump to the end and talk a little bit more about step 3. For any other patch that, like, if the module maintainer is still active or there's an active community, then maybe you just find it in the issue queue. So for this portion, it kind of doesn't really matter who writes the patch. A patch exists, we need to download it, and we need to apply it every time, even if the module gets a security update that's unrelated in the meantime. Otherwise, we'll have to re-roll the patch every time. The solution to this is drush patch file. A solution to this is drush patch file. What it does is it adds to a drush, well, a couple of drush commands, but the one that we care about is drush patch add. When you run it from the command line, you specify the module that you want to patch and the path to the patch that you want, to the full URL, or you can even do like just the issue number, and then it'll query you for which patch do you want to install if there's multiples. And then it also adds a patches.make. If you're not a person who uses Drupal's makefile or drush makefile, that's okay. This will work just on its own. If you do use Drupal or drush makefile, then it fits into that ecosystem. This file, the patches.make, keeps track of all of the patches that you have applied to that site. And then whenever you run drush.dl or drush up in the future, it will check that file to see if that patch is, like, does this module have a patch that I'm aware of that we need to respect? If so, I reapply it. Be aware that if that process, if drush says I'm unable to patch, then that could mean either the patch itself has to be re-rolled because it can no longer figure out how to apply it, or it could mean that, lo and behold, the module maintainer has actually, in fact, included it in their release, and so it's no longer necessary. Unfortunately, there's not an easy way to tell which that is other than by looking through the issue that you opened to see if that's been put in. So now we return back to the sort of beginning of the process. Really, step 0 when you have a problem with a module that the maintainer is absent is you look in the issue queue anyway. You're going to see, does anybody else have this same problem? So step 1 is to create your own issue and assign yourself to it. It's really easy. Your username will appear at the, by default in the assign box. And if it doesn't, you just easily drop it down. Then the sort of magical portion that is going to obviously be different depending on which problem you're having. You have to actually you have to make a patch that fixes your problem. The version control tab of Drupal.org in the issue queue does give you pretty good instructions on how to do that if that's not something that if you've done before. Once you've done that, it will just exist, and if you've never done that before, you're now an open source contributor. That counts. That's what open source is there's software that we can all improve, and then maybe nobody else has the same problem as you, but maybe they do, or maybe it's close enough that they learn from it. In any case, the Drupal Association has promised that the archives of these patches, these issue queues, will never go away as long as the Drupal Association exists. So I guess pay your dues if you want to keep those issues up, but in the meantime, they should be there forever. Even if nobody else ever has that problem, and even if the maintainer never looks at it, let alone includes it. And that's, I guess, what it looks like. Another quick note is that you should probably create the patch in a sandbox, unless you're a drush expert, or I'm sorry, a Git expert, with regard to sub-repos. But that's, if you are, great, go ahead. Next up, how to use some basic testing techniques to make sure that things aren't breaking when you do when you make updates. There was earlier a video, I believe, or I believe there was a session specifically on visual regression testing. We're only going to touch on that, so there's probably a better source. But basically, visual regression testing is this idea that you can use math to compare two pictures and find out how different they are. So if you take a snapshot of your front page, and then you take another snapshot an hour later, if nothing's changed, you'll get this like, hooray, nothing has changed. The use cases for that on dynamic websites are sort of limited. Most of these things do have a way where you can sort of carve out, only compare these things that I know don't change and leave the like latest news section alone because we know it's going to change all the time. But a good use case for it would be when you are doing a purely maintenance update. You can put a content freeze in place for an hour. You take a snapshot right before, you run your maintenance update, you take a snapshot right after. Those should be pretty much the same because we wouldn't expect a security patch to core to change the look of the front page. However, most of these frameworks that do this sort of stuff depend on other frameworks like Selenium or WebDriver.io, or they are online APIs that require a subscription. And there's a lot of them, and the marketplace is changing frequently. So instead, go to this URL, and there's that URL is a list of all of the major offerings in this space, what they cost, how to do them, and links to all of the stuff. That said, BHAT can be used for most of the same purposes, as long as we don't care about every update being pixel perfect. And we can identify some specific canaries to check. A few years ago, test-driven development was like the new hotness. You'd use a tool like Casper or Phantom to basically script up a bot in JavaScript, and that bot would go click around your website and log in as people and download stuff, and it would take screenshots, and it would be like, woohoo, you could see how you can do that. That still, of course, exists, and if you don't want to set up your own Phantom server, which can be, in my opinion, kind of annoying, and you do have New Relic, then you can basically write Phantom.js, well, really Node.js scripts that do exactly the same thing using New Relic Synthetics, which we'll take a look at in a little bit for a different purpose. The difference is behavior testing tools like BHAT, the goal is to abstract you one layer further from that by redefining or by defining reusable behaviors like looking for specific text or clicking links and filling forms. So BHAT on its own is not specific to Drupal. It's pretty great, but when you combine it with the Drupal extension, capital D, capital E, it's borderline sorcery. Let's take a look at a test-driven development style test that would have been absolutely amazing 5 years ago, or 6 years ago anyway, at whatever DrupalCon, I don't know, LA maybe? No, I don't remember. Anyway, this was all the craze. You have this JavaScript file, and you run it at the command line, and it says, first go to this URL, open a viewport of a particular size, assert that you get a 200 error, or not an error, but 200 status. Basically, go to the home page, find the login form, log in as Alice, and verify that it says, welcome Alice. Like, that's a great, my site is probably reasonably healthy kind of step to do. Okay, let's look at this same test again in Gherkin, which is the scripting language used by BHAT. Differences? This one is actually human readable. It will do exactly the same thing as the previous one, but you can have non-technical QA engineers or QA associates write these for you. You don't need to actually then convert them into JavaScript to get them to work. So how do we get to this step? BHAT with the Drupal extension will run in 3 different modes, each of which is more demanding to bootstrap, but then progressively more powerful. I'm going to kind of ignore the middle one and only talk about the easiest but least powerful and the hardest but most powerful. The least powerful is the blackbox mode, which will work right out of the box. You don't have, like, you download, you can grab Behat via Composer, and it just works. And it lets you test any website that you can reach from your machine where you've installed it. For the use case of testing that your site didn't break after an update, that's probably plenty, because your site is world routable, right? So you can run it from anywhere, go to your site, check for some stuff. You could visit the home page and make sure that the title is the same, that there are no visible error messages, that sort of thing. When you run this specific script in blackbox mode, you'll get a result that looks kind of like this, where the things that were sort of question marks have now turned green. Your asserts have come true. In blackbox mode, you can use a lot of predefined behaviors like click on a link or fill out a form. My personal recommendation would be to stick to things that anonymous users would do in blackbox mode. Because once you start getting down the authenticated user path, you'll probably want the complexity that is available to you in the Drupal API mode, which is next. In the Drupal API mode, this has to be installed on the same logical server that the web server is on, although that could mean that you run it against your dev version and sync the dev database down every week or something, and that's totally good. It doesn't have to be on your prod server. This unlocks a lot of new Drupal-specific behaviors, like creating users or creating nodes. And Behat will then clean up after itself after it runs this test. So in this test, it's like, I'm going to log in as an administrator and create a lot of nodes, like three different nodes, and then when I go to the content list, I should see that those nodes exist. What this test will do, Behat will actually create a new user with the administrator role. It will actually create those new nodes, and then once it passes all of its tests, it will delete that user and delete those nodes. As I said, there's also kind of an in-between mode, but it's not something I use, so if it meets your needs, great, but I can't really offer any meaningful advice on it at all. And I have an extra slide there for no reason. Okay, so in addition to testing when we know we're going to do something, either we're going to make a commit or we're going to do we're about to push a release, we can also increase our monitoring to make sure that things are healthy. We're going to start with a module that exposes diagnostic information that's specific to Drupal, and then we'll pull that output periodically, making sure that it's okay. So that's kind of the two steps. One is we make the website start securely broadcasting this debugging information, and second is we need something to go and actually get it and tell us when it's succeeding. We'll review 3 different methods for this. One is Nagios, which is a very well-supported monitoring platform. Another is New Relic, which is cloud-based and very, very, very popular, but can get spendy. And then we'll do something else if we have to. Why is this important? Well, ping tests, including, as a warning, the ones that are available on the free tier of New Relic, they only check for a 200 OK, and Drupal is famously terrible, especially Drupal 7, at returning a 200 when the website is not anything that you would consider to be up. This is a real example of a broke-ass website that is still returning 200 OK. So let's use something else. We're going to start with a module that provides some Drupal health data. And lo and behold, there is one specifically intended for Nagios, but we don't have to use it with Nagios, called Nagios Monitoring. For example, I like to know if cron has run within a certain interval, that it's not getting stuck and just looping and looping and looping. I like to know if the devel module has been left on in production. I like to know if the admin user has been left enabled in production. We have a policy. You don't ever, like, if you need to log in as admin, you enable the admin login, you log in, and then you disable it, because most of it you can just do from your own stuff. So you can roll your own, you can do whatever you like. I have in my sandbox, if you go to my sandbox at LDPM on Drupal.org, there's something called Lightweight Health Monitor, but it requires you to write more code to get it to work. This does not. This Nagios module lets us set an API key and then use that to retrieve information. And if you're already using Nagios on the systems end, then you're all set. It will speak like fluent native Nagios, and it'll go into the separate Nagios sort of dashboard. And look, it's incredibly easy and simple to configure. Not really. So this would actually be a candidate for setting those variables in a different way, or setting them once and then hiding and then removing the edit permissions from literally everybody so that people don't stumble in here accidentally. It's actually not that ridiculous because we can ignore most of the stuff that's on this list. So what we can do is set a unique ID string for the site that we're going to monitor. You want to enable the status page. You want to specifically tick this box because it says, let me use that API key to do all of my work. And then you go to this Nagios area and tick the boxes that you want to monitor or not monitor. And everything else is pretty much the same. So that's for the rest of these examples, that's the website side thing that we're going to do. And now we're going to look at a couple different ways to consume it. So if you do use New Relic, the specific type of synthetic you want is an API test. You can use the simple browser and scripted browser. They're more like the Casper kind of system. So they're not, I mean, they're fine. You can get as fancy as you want, but the API test is really good for consuming a JSON output, which the Nagios will do by default. Reminder that the ping type is basically worse than useless in this case because it'll say things are happy when they're not. This is the new Relic Synthetic that I wrote for just making sure that cron has been run recently and admin is turned off. I look for that text in the body of the response, and assuming that assuming that it's there, I report that that's okay. So in New Relic, you take that and you put it into this create new monitor portion. You drop that in. You can validate it right away. That will actually run a one-time instance to go check it. So that's real. That's like validate is actually would more accurately be called run now. The New Relic Synthetics, you basically pay by the number of thousands of times you want to do something every month, and then you set the frequency of these polls however you want. So you could set this to run every 8 hours from a server in New Jersey and then every 12 hours from a server in Seattle. And then you're getting some different intervals. Once you're satisfied that it works, you finish with the Create Monitor button, and then you can set up email notifications through New Relic, which we'll get back to in a second also. Now, if you don't have New Relic, like I said, it's kind of spendy, and you don't have Nagios, then we'll figure something else out. You can use Casper, Phantom, Selenium just by themselves. You take that script and you run them from the command line, and you see what happens. You can roll your own module like this that you then, or you run, this is actually a script, not a module. You can write a script that lives on or near your web server, run it through the cron yourself. This does basically the same thing as the other, except that it's in PHP instead of JavaScript. It goes and curls the Nagios page from your website, checks for anything that's labeled critical, And if it does, then it emails somebody to tell them that there's an alert. If you have Slack, you can add an email gateway to Slack that lets you receive alerts on your Slack channel. It's pretty easy to do. You just visit your Slack address /apps and you search for email, and then you add it, and it'll give you an email gateway address that you can then take, and any emails that get sent to that address will pop into the channel. Next up, using Drupal 7 as a data store for your modern front end, also known as headless Drupal. First, a quick disambiguation. Headless here basically means using Drupal to manage the content and provide the content editor UI, but using some other technology to present the content to the end consumer. Very popular topic for the last couple of years. There have probably been other talks. Again, we're going to focus on the Drupal 7 and then kind of where we would go if, or like when it would be good to move to Drupal 8, depending on your use case. Yes, this is using Drupal to publish a web service, which seems very ho-hum at the moment, but anybody else write bank software in the 90s? Just me? Just me. And that person in your office who looks like me, old, fat, beardy, or not beardy, they probably had to write crappy batch file programs that would do giant financial transactions over the phone lines like 3 times a day. And some of them worked at .coms when they did it. So to them and to me, any web service is a miracle, and I will just never stop admiring web services. But in any case, let's talk about a few options, 3 of which will use JSON, which is probably what you want, and 1 of which will use RSS just in case. In addition to RSS, we'll look at Views data source, which is a formatter for views that exposes different ways that you can output a view's results. The Venerable Services module, which exposes a very versatile API, including all of the CRUD operations. And once again, if all else fails, we can roll our own. Starting with RSS, this is probably only a good choice if you have a fair amount of control of both the back end and the front end. And that's because Drupal's built-in RSS technically validates against the WC or the W3C standard, but there are plenty of widely used RSS parsers that can't read it anyway. RSS is just not as it's not as fault tolerant as, say, JSON. Google used to provide a feed API for Angular, which is the and the mainstream replacement for it, which is RSS to JSON, doesn't play nicely with Drupal specifically. So there are other Node.js RSS modules. So in the event that the front-end team that you're working with or you yourself are already using an RSS parser in Node or React, then by all means, Drupal should be fine. But if not, then that's probably not a good fit for whatever your need is. Next is Views data source. For a lot of purposes, this is going to be great because it adds a formatter to the page display type for JSON. For example, if your use case maps with a views use case, then it's probably going to be a good fit because it has all the strengths of the views of views. On the minus side, it has exactly the same weaknesses as views also. So if you aren't going to be able to, like if what you really want is to display a single node, and views is surprisingly not good at displaying single nodes, then you may want to do something else. So let's take another look, or a closer look at how to set this up. This is a screenshot of a live Drupal 7 site, and in the purposes of this exercise, our goal is to extract the node titles and the images and make a like Pinterest board style version of that using just plain HTML and CSS plus AngularJS. So the first step is we create a view, or you add a display to an existing view. You select the page display and then the JSON document formatter, and then you'll get, it's hard to see on the screen, but that's like my preview has already turned into JSON. I would have expected to see something there. Oh, okay. Sorry, there was just an empty space. So on your style options in your view, if you leave the root object name and the top level child object fields blank, then your output will look something like this, and you'll be able to iterate through it pretty easily on the client side. That's reasonably client-friendly JSON that you're getting as a result. Let's take a look at, yay! So this is actually an iframe that actually pulled that live. This is this page. I see it on my screen, but let's see if I click that button, if that helps. Yes. Okay. So this is an actual. This is not a Drupal page. This is a designer created this page in CodePen.io using her preferred CSS and JavaScript frameworks. And all I did was add a little bit of AngularJS to fetch the information from that Drupal site that we saw earlier. This is like projector level, but if we wanted to look at, come on. So that would be like a more typical screen resolution version of what it is. So the components to make this work, aside from the Drupal 7 site that's just plain old publishing nodes, first we have the JavaScript file, which I'm calling photos.js. First we declare it to be an Angular module called demo. We create a controller within it called photos. We define the target URL of where we're going to go to get the API. In this case, it's /articles.json on the site that we created, and we fetch it. Since what we're getting back is JSON, it's already an object, we just send it right back up to the HTML, which looks like this. At the top, we include the main Angular.js script. We also include the one that we wrote. And by including the main, it makes a bunch of properties that start with ng- available to us. The div containing the actual content, we declare the app to be demo, the controller to be photos, and then we iterate through the different things using, and we can, we create a link at x.path, which is the individual path for that object that we're getting back, and then we display the image and the alt text. Option number 3 is services. With services, we can expose a URL by which any node on the site can be fetched as JSON. That's a pretty, we can do a lot more, but that's a pretty basic and common use case. The big drawback to using services is only that Drupal 8 is so much better at doing the API, like the API first initiative did a fantastic job. So if you're going to get into complex schemes like three-legged OAuth or something like that, then it might be worth tell your stakeholders, we can definitely still support this in Drupal 7, but this is a case where Drupal 8 gets us so much more that the time that we save in just doing like the three-legged OAuth setup might be worth escalating our plan to upgrade. I know that kind of defeats the purpose of this session, which is you're not allowed to upgrade. What do you do? But that's only for like those most complicated use cases. If you want to make every single node on your site available via JSON, then services is a great way to do it. You can do it in approximately 1 minute, which I can prove You go to your services, you add a new service, you assign the name, you make it type REST, and you declare the path of the endpoint itself. Once you do that, you go into the resources, you edit the resources. We're going to enable the node resource and specifically the retrieve operation under the CRUD section. Then you switch to the server tab. And since we want JSON, I'm just going to disable all of the things that are not JSON just to keep it simple. That's pretty much it. At this point in the demo, I'm opening a new window and going to that, or a new tab, and going to that thing that we just set up, /API demo /node /49.json, and we get a JSON representation of everything that was part of that node. It's worth noting that your status report will give you a warning if you don't assign session authentication or some other form of authentication, which I skipped in this session. But session works pretty seamlessly. It basically means that any client that is logged in gets the same privileges, gets the privileges that are associated with being logged in. I will also freely admit that I had to practice this a few times to get it under a minute because I was using the light version of my screen grab and I was therefore capped at a minute. I probably wouldn't have bothered, so it's okay to take 2 minutes. Finally, let's talk about a custom feed. It does exactly whatever you need it to do, but you have to build it yourself. But we're in Drupal, we're in open source, that's the point. If for some reason none of the other options are a good fit for you, it's like in a sense, it's like the difference between views and an entity field query. Some things are easier to do in views, some things are easier to do in entity field query. If you find that what you want to do is easier in entity field query, then it's very easy to write your own endpoint module and then do the query in entity field query. So for example, in this example, it's a pretty straightforward Drupal module. Up at the top, we're just declaring the path into the menu so that we can actually get to it. Our callback is just an entity field query that in this example, I want to find all of the nodes of type article that are currently unpublished, but were created within the calendar year that the user specified or the client specified on the API line. So if I go to feeds, my feeds, 2018, I want to find all unpublished articles that were originally created in 2018. The magic here is just on this last line, Drupal JSON output. That first sets the HTTP content type headers to the appropriate application JSON, and then it encodes whatever you've passed it in JSON, just using JSON encode, and then it barfs it out to the client. Those are really the only steps that are necessary, and you can verify it in Advanced REST client or any similar testing REST utility and you'll see right away that, okay, that gives me the one big JSON payload that I was looking at, and it's still basically the same stuff. One final thing to mention is CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. This is the mechanism that has been created and recommended by the W3C, and it has been implemented in all modern browsers to enable domains to share assets like, for example, fonts, or in our case, even just API endpoints across other domains. In a nutshell, if you don't set the headers on your website correctly, then the browser will return an error when you try to do when you try to use a JSON or a JavaScript front end. It won't be a problem if you write your own API consumer. It won't be a problem if some other server is writing their own API consumer. But when the JavaScript framework basically turns the browser into that API consumer, the browser will say, wait a minute, I went to this website, I went to this URL, it is now telling me to go get this other URL. I'm not going to do that without permission. Because prior to these frameworks, all that stuff was server-side. Now it's not. Luckily, Lullabot, any Lullaboteers in here? Yeah, well, Lullabot sponsored the creation of the cores module, which allows us to not care about this. I first learned about cores when I was trying to figure out why my REST client was not working. I opened it in the advanced REST client in Chrome, worked perfectly. Did the exact same thing using AngularJS. It gave me an error. Could not figure it out. This is why, is because of those headers. So because I want to continue not caring about those headers, I'm very grateful to Lullabot for sponsoring this module. That's all I got for you. Again, my name is Lawrence Miller. I'm at ACP. I live in Philadelphia. You can see these particular slides at this URL. Right now, if you go to the session page for this session, you'll see a slightly different video of this that I did in Philadelphia. This one, it's a little bit longer. This one, well, when the videos of this are ready, I will update the node accordingly. And we have a few minutes for questions, if there are any. I'm not sure how well I'll be able to answer them, but I'll try. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And I guess I'll see you next door in like 15 minutes. Thanks.